Hi everyone. Sorry for slight delay there. Sarah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. Is Will and Chris on the call? I'm just going to load up the slides. Cool. Okay, so we were going to do a talk about sort of GA data validation or GA GTM, etc. So I'm just going to load up. I'll share my screen. Okay, I'm probably going to use a combination of slides for this, so I may jump to another set of slides midway through. But the we do a lot of kind of like GA and GTM sort of configurations, monitoring, and sort of improvements. So data validation comes up a lot. And especially if you're needing to compare your Google Analytics 3 data with your Google Analytics 4, or compare it to sort of Shopify or Magento or other data sources, or compare Google Analytics to AdWords or to Facebook, that sort of thing. So we'll just cover some of our tips and tricks that hopefully you sort of learn a few things new from. Quick bit about ourselves. So we're based in Bristol, and which is the largest sort of tech hub outside of London, and doing lots of large-scale Google Analytics and GTM implementations and configurations. Some of the clients that we work with, although we're focusing more on the kind of in the weeds kind of bit here, it is also worth mentioning that you should also do your strategy stuff as well. So you should think about your like measurement maturity model and areas that you're strong in, both on like management, people, and tools, not just the sort of the data quality. Also on the data governance, training is kind of a key piece. It's kind of often sort of overlooked, but yeah, getting your the sort of cleaning up the data is useful, but also having a good sort of a data plan and data governance and good management buy-in is equally as important. So saying that, I'm now going to jump into the kind of in the weeds data quality kind of pieces. So why is data quality so important? Well, sounds really obvious, but it actually costs a lot more money to fix stuff that's broken than it does to actually get it right in the first place. I'll give you an example. So I was involved in a very large project with National Geographic a little while ago, and I can say from that process, I mean, they'd never used an agency to kind of manage their GTM account. It'd all been done internally, and they even had their own in-house tag management system, which was not really as good as GTM, and loads of legacy issues with it. The amount of time, effort, resource it took to unravel their old system and also clean up the GTM account that was running in parallel was huge. It would have saved so much time, money, effort, just getting it right first from the beginning. Spend a bit more doing it right properly, and that money will just count in dividends later. And I've seen this so many times before. Normally we get phone calls when stuff is broken or it's not been planned for properly, and there's no proper like data governance and etc. So just try and cover these sort of things early if possible. And the same also applies on GA4. If you can try and plan a sort of setup and cover all those possible mistakes that could go wrong later, you're going to be in a much better situation, especially with global and large scale deployments. I mean, this problem only becomes larger on these bigger brands, where like the time it takes to fix one small issue, if you replicate that 2,000 times, it's a lot of money and a lot of time and effort. So just some obvious ones really here, if you're not already kind of doing this. So in Google Analytics, a good kind of place to check for your data quality is to check for your Google CPC sessions to make sure that they're matching or similar to your AdWords sessions. So, or look at your bounce rate and unique page views reports to see if there's any sudden kind of drops or unnatural kind of trends. So usually doing a 1 year look back is a first starting point for that kind of activity. Sometimes this is a good thing if you've, for instance, with auto events, you've suddenly turned on those and bounce rate has suddenly improved, and that's fine. And obviously, if you add an annotation explaining something, but if there's no annotation and no, it's suddenly changed without any cause, then that's a possible something may have broken without you necessarily knowing about it. And also, comparing your GA transactions to your Magento transactions in your offline is also kind of relevant within there. There's a Data Studio report I'm going to show in a moment that shows you how you can compare those two. I can't share the link to it yet, but I'll share it in the notes kind of afterwards. And the other one, what could cause your Google Analytics account to not work? Obviously, ideally, if you can add the Google Analytics code in the right at the top of the page, as high up as possible, and that then reduces the chance of any conflicts or JavaScript errors preventing Google Analytics code loading below it. One that we encountered, and this is on Angular websites, was this one instance where the actual GA variable was being used by Angular, and that caused Google Analytics to stop working. It was not obvious until we looked in the GA debug tool, and then kind of GA object pushes being output, and thus we eventually figured out that it was this variable overwrite. So we actually renamed the object to GA2 within GTM, and that solved the issue. But bear in mind, JavaScript, if there's errors before it loads, that can stop the rest of the JavaScript being compiled. So this another reason why you'd want Google Analytics added in the top of the page to mitigate that. Another one, again, sounds obvious, but if you look at the goals the last 7 days and just check that there's not stuff like suddenly like not reporting in there. And also in GA4, you now have this change kind of comparison, so you can even sort by that to make it easier to see if something's not worked. If you're using like URL-based goals, and maybe there's an upper or lowercase issue, or someone has been using the word thank you with a hyphen, and they suddenly remove the hyphen, that's enough to stop the URL goals from triggering. So if you can try and build them in a robust way, so using like data layer values to say transaction or goal, that's less likely to break. And the same would be if you're using a CSS selector that's based off an element on a page, like a continue button, for example. If you can change that to maybe an HTML5 attribute or an ID, that's more robust, and thus your submit button tracking is going to be then more reliable and you're more likely to work. The other one, again, this is not fairly straightforward, but it still happens even now. If your clicks versus sessions looks okay, it's also worth well, in this case, actually, it doesn't. So in this case, was an account that maybe hasn't been linked because there's 1,000 sessions that have landed on the site with an AdWords GCL ID present. Sometimes, however, it works the other way around, as in you'll have clicks, but you'll have no sessions attached to those. So the most common cause there would be GCL IDs not turned on, or more likely stripped off. So I've just actually picked an example here where a / actually causes the link, causes the parameter to be removed. And this doesn't just affect Google AdWords, it would also affect UTM tags as well. So if I, for instance, click on that, you saw it did have a parameter on the end, it got stripped off. So that can be fixed by using either updating an htaccess redirect file to relay URL parameters, or to another possible way around it is to use a hash rather than a question mark. So that would give you a fallback method. Sometimes if query strings are removed, a hash sometimes is retained. So you can, at least then you get the CPC session being sort of stored in there. And on AdWords, you can do an account level URL setting that means that you just add it in one place and then it adds them to other places. And you normally need to do that for call tracking and CRM integration. So definitely worth doing as well. Another one would be in your AdWords reports. If you run all your final URLs through a status code validator. But when you do that, just add a fake GCL ID parameter on there. I've seen some instances of where URLs have been tested and they look fine on UAT, and as soon as you add a query string to the end, it causes those URLs to break. So run a bulk check on those. This was that clicks versus sessions comparison that I mentioned from Data Studio. In this instance, you can't block clicks, but you can block sessions, or you could have a track code missing on a landing page, which is called the sessions not to be stored. So here we've actually got about 15% difference between clicks and sessions. Highlighting possibly a problem or an increase in users kind of opting out of cookies and tracking. So that's something you really want to kind of monitor and look for any sudden like spikes or changes in that. If it has suddenly dropped or the deviation has got worse, it's got to like 80% then rather than 85%, and maybe something's gone wrong there and it needs kind of further investigation. And then Google Analytics spam, a lot of spam gets past the robot exclude kind of tick box. So there's a couple of simple things you can do to remove them. This sounds obvious, but if you don't use UA-1 on GA3 and just use UA-2, that actually stops the vast majority of spam traffic, because they guess at the account ID and then are only brute forcing the primary part of the ID. They're not brute forcing the integer on the end. So by just changing it to -2, you don't get a lot of that spam traffic. Adding a hostname include is also strongly recommended, just to whitelist your traffic, and thus any not set host names would be then removed. In GA4, you've got measurement secret, so you can add a flag that only your traffic would include. You can do that on GA3 as well using the page title, and in effect that that secret key is then an include key that means only whitelisted traffic gets included. If you see in your GA3 landing page reports landing page not set, it's also an indication of poor data quality. It normally happens when an event triggers before a page view. Now, don't worry about this too much if the proportions of it are very small, like less than 1%. But if it's greater than that, and it's like bubbling up maybe in your top 10 list here, then you probably just need to investigate your GTM triggers. There are a couple of ways of fixing this. The first, though, would be to add tag sequences. So on your 30-second heartbeat, make sure it triggers as a tag sequence after your page view. Or if you've got scroll tracking active, make sure it has the consent updated or done with page view as one of your elements in the trigger group. So oops, I think those slides just got hidden on there. Here we go. So that's how that looks on here. So here's the trigger group, and then here's the tag sequence. So there's a heartbeat that's actually loading after the page view in these two instances. You can also add a blocking rule that's triggered after the page view is declared, as well as another sort of safeguard. The other obvious one would be self-referrals. So this applies on both GA3 and GA4, and ironically, even if you use the setup wizard to migrate from GA3 to GA4, it doesn't copy across exclude referrals. So you have to go into GA4, go into the data streams, go into more settings, and update your exclude referral list. You can do regular expression exclude referrals in GA4 now, which saves a bit of time. But if you don't do it, you're going to see these internal referrals in your referral report, and your data is pretty much going to be broken. You can on GA3, you can also, let's say it's a website using Stripe or PayPal, they're common known offenders for overriding the referral. So you normally need to add them in there. We sometimes have used setting a null referral on thank you pages, so that at least then you don't need to maintain a long list of like 20 like banking websites for exclude referrals. We've not actually done that on GA4 yet, but we've got one coming up, which is actually GA3 to GA4 migration, where we've got to set a null referral, and it should be a very similar kind of process. And then obviously that means we don't need to maintain an exclude referral list for payment providers. If there's a sudden change in bounce rate and you haven't turned on a bunch of auto events, then obviously that's a flag that something's not right. This could be caused if you add, let's say, widget or accidentally set a heartbeat or a JavaScript error tracking to interactive rather than non-interactive, it could cause bounce rate to break. The most common reasons are actually adding a page view twice by accident, or adding a page view on GTM initialized and then also on a history change per state. That can cause it like double invoking. If you set on non-Ajax sites, if you set the page view to once per page, that can help mitigate that problem. And if you notice the page view spiking, but the unique page view is not spiking, then again, that's an indication that you may have double tracking kind of active. So within the slides coming up, we've got an example of using Screaming Frog to kind of check to see if you've added tracking code twice on a site, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. URLs also need to be kind of clustered. So upper and lowercase, so Google Analytics 3 and Google Analytics 4 are both case sensitive. So it causes 2 rows. In GA4, you can't do lowercasing in the tool, you have to do it within GTM. And also in GA4, you have to do exclude referrals in GTM as well currently. And so, yeah, this is a standard filter that you would normally need to add. Obviously, be careful when you do add this that you haven't got any goals that are sort of case-sensitive goals, because obviously that would cause us to stop working. So here's a cheat sheet of some of the technical tools and processes that we've used in the past. So that's just a GTM checklist. So I'll just put that, in the chat window, which actually probably references some slides. So I'm just going to explain some of these tools and tricks that we've used in the past. The auto QA sheet, that's one where we had a site that had lots of events. So what we did is we assigned an integer or an ID to each event. It was actually a 2-part integer, so it was a category ID and an event ID. And then we stored that as a hit level custom dimension. And then we used a Google Sheet for pulling that data in from Google Analytics and then managing the list of IDs. So it created a feedback loop that showed us if an event ever stopped working. And in the one instance, we found that a tag which was referencing as an outclick to a particular page, and that link got changed, and thus the event stopped firing. So yeah, that feedback loop method definitely works. And also, given that GTM also now has the ability to kind of meta tag IDs, there's a cleaner way of doing it. So we may at some point add that into our GTM cleaner tool for tag IDs and auto validation using the data from those events. But I've linked through to the sheet that shows you how to do it instead. Also, we normally use a straw man of a list of kind of unit tests. So we would check, make a copy of the e-commerce complete page only, and just check that page on its own in our own sort of sandbox. So if I click on this and just show you, that link's not working, done it. I'll update that link afterwards. So what we're trying to do there is only be able to kind of test quickly by creating a bunch of test pages without needing to put test orders through a site. So that's massively speeded up the QA testing process that we would normally sort of use or sort of follow. On the process side, I've linked to some Gantt charts there and like deadline planners and user access audits and a GTM auditing template and some videos on there. So you need both the technical and the tactical to kind of do a project properly. There are some also other validators. So if you don't want to use Screaming Frog, you can use some third-party plugins that will sort of check for like tag flows and data flows. I think Firefox had quite an interesting kind of one ages ago. and you can see where tags are relaying through to. In Chrome, you can actually use, there's a feature for a JavaScript file or a pixel where you can work out the dependency element of a pixel, which does something similar to this. For Screaming Frog, I'm going to just jump to an example. So what we normally do with Screaming Frog is we edit the Screaming Frog default configuration. So Screaming Frog has the ability to import a setup. So you can basically say, okay, I want to crawl these pages and I want to look for this variable or this series of variables, and then it outputs it as kind of a CSV file, which is great because you can then say, okay, I want to search for ga.javascript or gtag or analytics.javascript, etc. So are those libraries present anywhere on the page, or are they not present anywhere? So it really quickly gives you a list of pages that are missing one of those libraries. Obviously, a sign that GA is definitely not working if that's not present, but you can actually go a step further, and you can also use the extraction kind of function. So you can say, go and get the first data layer value that was rendered on the page, or if there's an inline data layer push that happens maybe afterwards, go and grab that. So you can quickly grab those the header data layer in Excel form and basically kind of work out if pages are missing a data layer or what they're grouped into. So we ran this recently on a site that is using GTM for Drupal, and it allowed us to then get these URL clusters and compare a content grouping report with the crawl data just to make sure that they're mapped correctly. It can also be used to crawl JSON LD data and RDFA or just any JavaScript variables. And this could also be like a Telium data layer or not necessarily just a GA data layer. So Screaming Frog is ridiculously cheap. So a really good way of just building a quick kind of data validator. And I've linked to the config file that we use. So if you want to import that, be my guest. There's always going to be a need to do GA3 versus GA4 in the same way that we used to have to do Universal versus GA Classic. Or they are much more different beasts. So GA4 much more likely to be different. You obviously do have the debugger in GA4 for like single validation, just to check that events are being processed correctly and break out individual parameters within each event. Will has linked to an article on there where it's got a list of GTM kind of tools. One, I've mentioned this in here only because it kind of covers a little bit of validation, and it's an area that is commonly goes wrong. So consent mode and also GDPR itself, the reason it commonly goes wrong is down to normally one of three things. Either the variables, that the default variables are not set. So for instance, with consent mode, you have to say like analytics is, or let's say ad storage is off by default. And if you're outside of Europe, maybe analytics is on by default. If you don't declare those defaults, it can cause code on the sell complete page not to, or potentially to get blocked because the default for the allow is not declared in time. It's necessary to basically use ideally a header data layer or a header values for consent mode, and then have the configurations for consent mode in the actual tool itself. The other thing can also happen, which is if you're using tools like Autoblock on OneTrust or on Cookiebot, if that Autoblock code loads after GTM, then it can't stop the code from running and you get a compliance issue. So again, a need to run a validator or crawler, check for the position of these tools, and although normally a giveaway would be like a cookie is dropped when it shouldn't have been on a home page. Probably going to roll out an update to our GTM cleaner at some point to check for consent mode classifications. but keep watch this space for that. Long term, it's something that all sites are potentially going to need, because more and more users are opting out of cookies, and thus you don't want to have 15% missing. Thus, you need to upscale, and it's a key feature in GA4. And a key kind of USP. And to give you a scenario where Facebook was forced to kind of on apps to change to opt-in mode, and their tracking went for 100% down to 10%. In that situation, you have to use kind of upscaling in order to get to model back up. So if your scaling is wrong with the be it the 10% sample or the 85% sample, that's going to cause the upscaling also to be wrong. So important to configure correctly. The thing about this as well is if you're using a modal cookie wall versus a floating footer, the configurations for those are very different. So another thing that can go wrong. And also with those default settings, we would normally recommend trying to load an IP lookup tool first to work out if those users are in Europe, and then set the defaults and then load GTM. So there's a number of kind of best practices to try and to get it to work in an optimal kind of way, and avoid any remarketing tags firing outside of consent or outside of or inside of Europe. This was the auto QA tool that I mentioned kind of earlier. So and I've linked to the Google sheet that shows that working. So this is the event ID flowing through here, the value being added into a GTM tag, passing through to a Google sheet. That sheet then getting the event values back from Google Analytics, matching them to the ID, and basically creating this feedback loop. So it worked really effectively, and something I hope other people will take advantage of, especially on large scale setups where you've got lots and lots and lots of events that need to be monitored. So here's it actually working here. So we've got this ID here, the first part being a category ID, the second part being an integer, and then that's I normally suggest putting that at the front of the tag, just so it's also kind of slightly easier to sort of see, and because it sorts alphabetically. Yeah, cool. All right, and here's some of that data flowing through. So we've got the live events here, the development events. And this one also does a matching based off event category action label as a fallback method if the event ID is not present. So in this case here, we've got an outbound click, which is on development, is not being tested much, it looks like. Okay, well on the Q&A with this method that I've mentioned here for event IDs within GTM, have other people used it or used anything similar? The other one, again, and this is more on the process side. So we personally, or we normally set up a separate GTM account for development and live. The reason we do this rather than using GTM environments is that with a separate development and live is you then get access to user controls, and you can restrict certain users from publish access or write access on live, which you can't do on environments. So this is an example of a server-side switch for splitting out a live and development environment. You can also use JavaScript to do the same thing, just matching on the host name. It's strongly recommended, and the other benefit is it adds a feature step. So if you're on the free version of GTM and you don't have access to the approval queue, then you can, in effect, the point where the development GTM account is exported up to the live GTM account, then you can do a peer review at that point. So it's very much the way that we recommend doing it. You can still use workspaces if you so wish on the development profile, but yeah, we would normally recommend that you don't, unless it's a massive deployment and it's very difficult to it's not possible to have like one large development account. So here's an example of that server-side switch. We'll be running in client-side mode here, where we say if the host name is a known whitelist, change it to GTM dev, otherwise leave it on GTM live. Another sort of safeguard that you can do would be add a debug blocking rule. So here we're saying don't trigger this code on live. So that's a good practice again. So someone has to physically remove that trigger in order for it to load. Obviously, if you're testing some code and you don't want it accidentally deployed, because obviously that would affect data quality, then you could use this method as a fail-safe. And this one only shows when you've got preview mode activated, because it's a negative of a negative. You can also, as another sort of safeguard, you can use GTM whitelisting or blacklisting to block custom HTML or template scripts. So we normally use this on sites like banking sites where there's login pages. And where we need to make sure keystroke logging is permanently disabled and impossible to enable. So you can do an if statement to say, if this URL matches this known list, then blacklist custom HTML scripts or custom templates and JavaScript variables. Generally, though, I would say trying where possible to keep this active, because it does give you more control. And if you need to add, let's say, SEO data layer values, like for JSON-LD, or a custom tag that's not in a template, then yeah, you need to use custom HTML to do it. We have looked at using JavaScript sandboxing, but the benefits of using it are fairly limited. So we've not done, though we're building our own templates for, let's say, I've got an SHA256 hashing sort of template we're building in Sandbox JavaScript, and we've also got an updated version of the CookieBot banner, which we've edited there, Sandbox JavaScript, and we would other than those two pieces, we wouldn't recommend using Sandbox JavaScript within GTM, because it's, well, basically a bit pointless, especially given that server-side sort of gets around some of the things that are needed. Here's the example of those sort of sandbox tests that you can use. So here's a homepage example. A sale complete page is somewhere on this list. And a custom dimension test. So when running, if you build out a list of tests like this, then you can rapidly check something is working, or run your Selenium tests or your QA tests, and you've got your input and output, and in effect a robust QA testing process. So these in effect are called straw man tests. Making sure JavaScript error tracking is also really important, so that if there's either an error in GTM or even outside of it that could be affecting GTM, at least you've got a log of that. You don't necessarily need to log all JavaScript errors. Sometimes on large sites, a 10% sample is enough, but just having that active can catch some of these implementation kind of issues. Just a quick sort of shout out for the tool that is totally free, and we're just trying to increase awareness of it. So that's our GTM Cleaner tool. This will standardize your GTM account, and that's the first step that you need to do to help with like data quality, or at least the fastest kind of area that you can improve. It has a tick box on there for deleting unused tags and fixing some of the known kind of problems within GTM, like not having like scroll tracking or heartbeat and stuff kind of active. So please kind of check that out and provide feedback. As I said, we will do a consent mode flavor of it at some point, and it also has a tick box for GA3, GA4 migrations within it. And I've seen that Google have made the management API for GA4 available soon, so we're probably going to add some management API features for copying custom dimensions into custom definitions in it fairly soon as well. So watch this space on that tool. I'm going to just jump over to some other kind of areas. While I do that, I'm just going to check the questions. We've got a question from Mikesh. You mentioned that the checking GA code on all pages through Screaming Frog. How can you check on a big e-commerce website? So the first thing I would say on that, so if you've got an e-commerce website that's on Magento, I would say that you should really migrate to Anawave for Magento. It would standardize the data layer itself, and then means you don't need to run a crawler on it. There is a native Magento like GA setting where you can add your account ID, but it's not really as good as the Anawave plugin. And the Anawave does a really good GA3 data layer. So yeah, I'd say change your question around on that one. I would say if, let's say, not to pick any examples here, but if it's a website has like, let's say, like moved a data layer code around. So let's say the GTM data layer code was like in the right place. So for instance, it was above GTM and then it's accidentally got moved to the wrong place, so it's below GTM. A crawler would be able to detect that sort of thing. And the same with if code is moved outside of GTM with Hotjar, for example, that could cause problems with data governance and stuff kind of later. So yeah, there are other things that you would be able to kind of detect from a crawler, which would the position of tags and just looking at the code and spotting those kind of obvious errors would come about. And also normally you would put your GA code right at the top, or your GTM code, and you put your non-critical code below that. So like Lead Forensic and Chatbot would go below GTM. So there's some improvements that could be done there that may help with like sort of some of the data governance sort of pieces there. I'm just reading this question from Matthias. Sorry if it's a dumb question, but what can scroll tracking be used for? I mean, I've never seen it on any reports. Can you explain a bit more? So we did a session last month where we were talking about GA4 migrations, and one of the differences between GA3 and GA4 is that GA4 has things called auto events, which mean that it's not just the page view that's sent, it also does a scroll after, let's say, 75% of the page, or after maybe either 10 seconds or 30 seconds has elapsed. So that means that the bounce rate, or aka engagement rate, is more accurate on GA4. However, what you can do on GA3 is you can turn on the equivalent functionality for scroll tracking and heartbeats, so you get your bounce rate to be comparable to GA3. So the problem is that on GA4 it's just tick boxes and it can't really go wrong. On GA3, when you turn on this extra functionality, you have to make sure the order that tags load is valid. So for example, you'd load the page view first, and then you would say, okay, now send a heartbeat because the page view is executed, and thus it'd be impossible for the page view to load before the event to load before the page view. Common problems may be also if you've got a cookie banner or a modal banner, and the scroll tracking or heartbeat haven't been sent as a sequence, then they get either they start sending with outside of compliance, or they don't send at all. So trying to set them in a dependency chain and forcing the pages to load first is the best way to kind of do it. Now I can imagine people are not going to the bottom of the page. Yeah, so on mobile devices, people are much more likely to scroll to the end, which is why on that screen where we showed the example of a where is it, scroll, here we go, we've got, this is a trigger group. So this one's saying that the user must have scrolled for 75%, 15 seconds must also has a lap, so not like straight scroll to the end, and then also they must have accepted the cookie banner. So that's an ideal scenario, because the cookie banner is going to make sure that the page view sort of fires, and it reduces the chance of it firing in the wrong way. It would also be a good idea to make sure that the page priority for the page view is high, and then the page priority for the event is low, just to also try and mitigate any landing page lock not set. I actually need to add that in this list as a fourth bullet point. Are there any other sort of questions we've got on on the call. Or did anyone raise their hand and ask a question kind of live? Otherwise, Sarah, I'm going to ask you if you've got any questions. Oh, we've got a question here. So do you know if there are any plans for GA4 to have similar data filters functionality, or how can this be replicated? I can only seem to be able to filter by internal, external. Yeah, can this be managed in DTM instead in the meantime? Yeah, great question. The GA4 features for filters is pretty limited, unless obviously you have profiles access, where you can do like server-side filtering. So you're basically restricted to doing filtering either in the browser as in client side, so with custom variables. So the example would be with URL parameters, which needs to be done in the browser, or you can do sort of filters and refinements on the server if you've got GTM server side active, and the server can then send the data over to Google Analytics 4. There's no other way around that currently. Either filters, well, unless Google Analytics 4 expand out the filters functionality, but at the moment, because the sub properties is a GA360 only feature, I don't think they're going to do that anytime soon. So you'll have to use the JavaScript kind of workarounds instead, which yeah, I mean, we normally add like about 40 standard filters just to sort of clean up the data with like lowercasing and removing email addresses and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's kind of annoying that we've now got to shift that to into the DOM or into the server to do the cleanup instead, which would be much better actually doing it within the tool. But yeah, so yeah, no, I don't have, there's no other way to do it, unfortunately. But great question. We'll just see if there's any other questions. We'll just give it a moment, otherwise I think we're going to wrap up.
One more question came in.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, so from Mateus, in the current state of GA4, do you think GTM server-side will replace GTM client-side? I think you mean. Well, I mean, even with server-side, you still need to load a GA4 library as in analytics.javascript, and that library is then used to then syndicate to your analytics to you know, Facebook and GA3 and AdWords, etc. So it's more of consolidation of libraries at the moment. There's still going to need to be some work done in the browser to then send to the server. I think the thing is more the number of those plugins is reducing. I think the other piece of the puzzle is the browser functionality. So if browsers introduce like a browser consent mode or a consent API, and then that information would then pass into the server, like from then that would still be client side. It's just going to get past server side. So yeah, you're still going to need a blend of both, and also there are certain features that only exist within client side. So clickstream data, like your Hotjars and your sort of session cams, those mouse coordinates is very much client side. You can't run that server side. It's just not possible. And also, if you've got certain sites that are built in like Ajax or React, and you need to record those history change events, or anything that doesn't send the data like to the server, like an anchor or hash change, then again you're forced to use client-side code. So yeah, it's a mix of both, but more consolidating of that client-side code. The server obviously is great for kind of moving like lookups into the server. So page IDs, user IDs, transaction IDs. Potentially that can be shifted from client side to server side, so there's some optimization there, especially with the Google Firestore sort of features. So yeah, mix of both, but to get more of consolidation and then shifting to server side lookups. But yeah, cool, great question. Cool. I think
yeah, I have one more last question for you. So can the attendees of the webinar get in touch with you in case they would like some help regarding their GA GTM settings?
Yes, so we've got our should be an email here. So hello at I will get access to that, or fill at. So if you want us to do, we normally will do like a 1 hour free sort of GTM audit of an account. So if you want us to sort of take your account apart and see if you've got any kind of data quality issues, you know, we're more than happy to do that for free. Just let us know the domain and the account ID. And we normally do like a 1 hour like presentation where we go through it and explain what's wrong with it and what can be improved. And we don't actually need access to GTM for that, so we can use like a sort of backdoor way of actually seeing what's happening within the GTM account. We just need the domain and your so yeah, feel free to reach out if you want us to run an audit. For GA, obviously we do need access to that in order to audit a GA account. We have also more recently we've been auditing GA4 setups of other agencies. So if you want us to do a GA4 review, especially if you're doing a large rollout, we can also kind of do that. Cool. All right. Hopefully that's helpful for everyone, and we'll sort of catch up next time. All right. Thanks, everyone.